Welcome to Early Intervention Matters, the podcast that helps parents, teachers, and health professionals understand the diagnosis, treatment, care, and support of children with autism, ADHD, Tourette's, and other neurodevelopmental challenges. Your host, Dr. Inyang is a consultant neurodevelopment pediatrician, and she will provide insight through interviews, answering questions, and breaking down complicated topics. By sharing stories from parents and professionals in the field, we hope to make sense of what can be an overwhelming topic. Early intervention is crucial with children with developmental difficulties. Yes, early intervention matters. And now, here's your host, Dr. Inyang.
I think it's usually a big shock when people come across, and like you said, the terminology waiting list, it sounds strange to so many people when they come over because it's a different system there. So in the UK, as in some other countries similar to the UK, when children are usually referred in, so people can't just work into a specialist service. And for the National Health Service, people can do that, sometimes can request for private assessments when it's quicker, but for the general National Health Service referrals, the GP usually refers a child into the service, and then the professionals, the specialists in that service, look through the paperwork to see whether that's an appropriate referral for the service. And part of the information that's usually gathered includes getting information from the school. So for children who are newly diagnosed, after the referral comes in from the GP, well, before then, the GP has to get information from school to support that referral they're making to the health service. And when that referral comes in, the professionals, the specialists in that service, then screen those referrals to see whether they're suitable. And they then go on to, the famous waiting list. So that waiting list, unfortunately, has grown so long because we've had increasing numbers of referrals. And this is a national issue. It's across the UK. So the referrals were already growing, but in the last couple of years, even since COVID, it's become very long, sadly, which means children are waiting longer to get their assessments. And the pathways differ in different places. So how to then eventually get assessed after they've been seen is different. But the waiting list is usually the time between when the GP has referred and that referral is accepted to when the child is actually seen for the first time. So when that child is seen for the first time, the pediatrician does what we call an initial developmental assessment, where they get a history from the families, they examine the child, they do some form of developmental assessment with the child. If the child is under 5, if the child is older than 5, they usually require the educational psychologist to see the child and assess the child's level of learning. And then they get information from school. Sometimes it involves observations in school, if it's for younger children especially. And then if a child is thought to have, say, autism spectrum disorder, then there's a structured assessment that's done. So that assessment is not just involving the clinician, but involves clinician and other specialists like speech and language therapists, or in some cases, psychologists. So it's quite a process before the child gets in and given a diagnosis, which I think it's a bit different when we're in other countries. So some from countries like in Africa and all that, that kind of level of process is not there. So, but again, I think one thing here is that the assessments are done in a robust manner so that wherever those reports of the assessments are taken to, people can see the process in which the child was assessed, and it's not somebody doubting that was this really there. So yes, it can, and unfortunately the waiting list has grown over time. But what I would say is, for families is that if you identify differences in your child, it's important to try and get the school, your child's school, to write a letter, a supporting letter, identifying those differences as well, so that the family can then take that letter to the GP for a referral to the service. Because if the school is not providing the right information or information to support the assessment, that's where some children have not been referred in, because it was felt that they were not presenting with features that needed for their assessment. But I think this all boils down to knowing your child. So for families who struggle to get the school to reflect what they are saying, if your child is going somewhere else, like a childminder or play group, you can also get those people to report on your child's presentation and use that as a supporting letter as well, in addition to whatever you get from school. Because some children may not really present in the full way at school and may present differently. Likewise, like what you said, I like what you said about during assessment, if you feel your child is not presenting the way, you should feel free to express that to the assessor. And one of the things that's quite useful, that I found useful, is when families have sometimes shown me videos of things that the child has been able to do, where the child is not doing that during the assessment, but the child has been able to do it outside in different settings. Getting videos of that helps the assessor to know that actually the fact that the child is not doing those things here does not mean that the child does not have those abilities. So having some recordings of your child actually doing certain activities can be helpful, especially, and it does happen. Children get very anxious in settings they're not free with, and they can just shut down and not show their true abilities in that setting. And a child may have an off day. A child might be unwell that day. And it's not fair to assess a child who is unwell and benchmark the child and give a report. None of us will function at our best if we're not well. So imagine somebody marking our performance on a day when we're not well. So I think that's quite important as well. So coming to, in terms of, I think we touched on this, you've touched on a lot of the tips that you've given. And I know that these are not things that you've just reeled out of your head, very practical things that you have walked that journey. And it's not surprising that the outcomes that you have had has been really good, which, I can say that, because I'm a witness to that. So I just want you to give us some tips. So do you think, what were those things that made things work for you, Izegbua? I know there have been hitches and all that on the way, but I think with the outcome, which, very commendable, what would you say contributed to that outcome?
Thank you. Yeah, that means a lot coming from you, because we know how closely we work together on our journey. One thing I want to say, something I really want to emphasize for the listeners, is understanding that the journey is individual to your child. And so when we say success, I don't want anyone visualizing anything beyond what success means for your individual child. So it's not what X's child looks like or acts like. It's not about somebody else's child being in university or whatever. That's not success. Success is your child's personal best at every stage in their development. So if, for example, I will measure success as yesterday my son couldn't zip up his coat. Today he can zip up his coat. That's success, right? So I'm putting that out there so that parents feel encouraged. And for me, I'm one of those people that I'm kind of like tunnel vision of what I believe is the right thing to do. First of all, accepting my children for who they are, and not feeling like I need to explain about them to anybody else. That first of all is really a good starting point, because it's an individual journey. It's unique for parents and families. And you would have yourself in a society where you would have other people that don't have the same or similar journeys as you do. You need to be able to accept that this is your journey at this point in time. It doesn't make you bad. It's not your fault. it's just what it is, right? And what it is, when you get to that point of understanding that this is what it is, then you can determine how you want to move forward. That ties into not denying. That denial can be a challenge, and our denial can either be overt, as in, I deny this is not happening to me, it's not my portion, or your denial can be covert, as in you don't realize that you're in denial because you're kind of kicking the ball forward and not taking specific decisions like it's time to do speech therapy, it's time to. So we need to be, spend time really internalizing and checking that, look, it is what it is. First of all, understand that this is what it is. If things change, they will only change because you're doing something in the direction of where you want to go to. It's not sitting there in a pity party and saying, oh, woe is me. That's a waste of time. Not only for you, but for your child. Because every moment you're spending in that pity party, your child is getting older. We have to realize, I mentioned that my children are adults now. If we spend time in that pity party, they would not progress to their next level of being at their personal best, right? So you have to hold on and get one child up. Sorry about that. So I was saying that avoiding that pity party and understanding that you have to move in the direction of where you want to get to. So understand accepting the child. So I'm not diminishing where anyone could be on the spectrum, whether it's very significant health needs or whatever. Accepting that that child has needs and supporting the needs, right? So if it means that you have to get the right dog care, making sure they're going for their checkups, I'm a Christian, but not removing yourself from the reality of you need to be working towards your health, right? So you pray and everything. That is not to be diminished, but you pray and I always say to people that are very Christian and that follow the Bible, understand that when you look at I have to go into this right now for anybody that is listening, that even when Jesus was healing, the healing is a process. Please, guys, it's a process. And there's a story of the 10 lepers as they went. So you have to be moving towards what you want to achieve. If you say you want your child to be read very well, you have to teach the child to read. They're not just going to wake up because you talked about, you prayed all night and suddenly be suddenly be literate. Let's be practical about these things. If you want your child to see, they have eye vision issues, and you give them glasses, So these are the kind of things that we need to, be practical about. It doesn't diminish our faith. You just have to, you can't say, I want my child to be a lecturer and not teach them how to read, or to be a great scientist and don't put them through science classes. The same thing for your child that is on the spectrum. You can't say you want that child to be, for example, potty trained and not potty train them. These are those the practical things. The ones that for some reason, even medically, they can't be potty trained. You cannot leave them without giving them the appropriate support with, continence, So I think there's the mindset of understanding that this is an individual that needs support, and the support can come in different forms. Now, when you notice that your child has special interests, show it like you're not sure a neurotypical child. Again, back to understand that child that you be given, you're a caretaker. It's your responsibility to nurture that, regardless of what the needs are. And it's your responsibility to nurture their talents and their interests. So if you find whatever it is that the child is interested in is music, give them the instrument. This mindset of thinking that because a special needs child is suddenly going to be doing things extraordinarily is almost like making them, they're already lagging behind, and they now want to put a demand that they should move faster because you believe in God, or you believe that it has to be miraculous. Well, put in the work. Understand the process. So if the young person has an interest in music and they start off by banging the piano, don't just stop and say, well, he's banging the piano and therefore he's not going to learn the music. Why do you think so? Why can't you just continue doing music until forever until the child gets better. So what I would say, don't stop. Whatever you're doing, just do it. And don't think that's because you've done it today, tomorrow, for 2 weeks, and the child is not picking up, and therefore I'm going to stop. Why are you stopping? Right? So I think for me, I'm quite a persistent person. They say to me that I'm like a pimple, just like a birthmark. I don't stop. And I don't stop. And that doesn't, if it's not working, also understand that you want to get to a destination. If you want to go down to London, you can take as many trains. You can detour, you can change platforms, you can, do stopovers. You're still ultimately going to get a destination. And that's where I see the journey, to say, look, you ultimately want to do the best for your child, but be flexible enough to know that your journey will have detours, but keep supporting.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Izegbua. That's really, really helpful. And I think you've touched on some key factors. And as a professional, as a pediatrician, seeing lots of children, I think those key factors really resonate. The first thing is, like you said, not being in denial. And I think, especially, I would like to reiterate this for our community, is that the question of sometimes denial about what is actually going on. And I think I like what you said, is that the more you are not confronting what you need to do, the more time you're spending in not making that child progress. And this is what happens is, and sometimes as a professional, I see children where there's been denial that has delayed that process of seeking help or accessing help. Some families will say, I don't need the help. There's nothing happening. They're getting better. They will get better. Like you said, faith. You can have faith, but it's how you exercise that faith, because you've got to be working to make that faith come into action. So you can't just sit down, like you think you put it well. You can't just sit down and say, I have faith that the child is going to speak, and then you're not doing anything. Then there's no stimulation, there's no accessing the resources to support the child. And again, this is something that I come across in my professional career, where in our communities, and I think there is a lot of, cultural bait and, saying that you don't want to be different, that your child is accessing this support. You don't want to be different in your community. So sometimes that's the hindrance that prevents people. And you've talked about being patient and persevering. And it brings me back to one of the first things you said before, that your child is on their journey and not comparing your child to another person. So when you persevere, you're persevering with that child and working with that child, not putting pressure on that child, but you know that the ultimate is, that child to achieve the best for themselves. And it doesn't matter which way, the detour, what fallbacks you have, and starts and stops, is just continuing to work with your child, and not measuring it and saying, I expected this to have happened 6 months ago and it didn't happen, and then you get disillusioned and then you give up. And sadly, this is where things have happened when families are not working together, where discords have happened and one partner not working with the other partner. And sometimes the children get isolated, which is really painful. So these are the kind of things that are fallouts from those things. And I can say that, those points you've raised are very, very important. Knowing your own child, your home, just having that agreement that you're all working together, and including that child in your child. We're all different, and your child brings a lot into the family. They're a very important part of that family. They bring fulfillment and joy, and just appreciating that in your child is very important. And working, taking each day, but having goals that you're working with your child. And some days your child may have an off day and not feel like doing certain things. Appreciating that, not feeling that because this child hasn't been able to do this today, that's going to slow your progress. Because you sometimes have to ask yourself, who's made this arbitrary landmarks that you have set? Is it you? Is that for your child's, favor? Are you the one that's set by the end of this year? The child has to do this by the end of that. Because when you start setting those arbitrary goals, that's when you start putting yourself under so much pressure. And unfortunately, that translates to the child because the child can pick up on your anxiety and your frustrations. The child can pick up on all that. I think those are some really key things that you've mentioned, and I think it's so useful. And I can really say that, yes, everything you've said is correct. And because I've seen that you working through all that process to lead to the successful outcome for your children. And as you said, your children's journey is different from other people. So everyone has to really, work with their child to identify how they're going to work with them. Thank you so much, because you've given us lots and lots of nuggets. It's been an interesting conversation, and I always learn a lot from families, and thank you so much, because, you've taught me a lot. Children have taught me a lot in my career, and I think it goes well for professionals as well. One thing I always say to professionals is that we come in with our knowledge, but actually the people that teach us is our patients, the children that we see, and the families, and we learn a lot from them every single day. I learn a lot from my young people, and I'm fascinated by their progress. It's very fulfilling for me. So thank you so much for sharing. So just
Thank you.
every round of this conversation, I really don't want this conversation to end. It can go on and on, but we have to round up. So I just wanted to say that there are families out there, and this journey can be sometimes quite challenging and difficult. So there are people at different stages, people who haven't even started the journey, and they know that there are differences in their child, and haven't started that journey yet for many reasons. Some people who are at the beginning of that journey and just thinking about the process and the hurdles they've got to go through. People who have been on the journey for a long while and thinking, I'm not seeing anything here, I'm just disillusioned. What do I do? What would be your advice to the families we've talked about, and any other advice that you may have for them?
Okay. Well, I'm still on the journey, like I mentioned before. So if you're just starting, allow yourself grace, be kind to yourself. It's what I'll say, that it's not your fault. And sometimes it takes a while to accept that it's not your fault. But nothing that you could have done or not done. It's what it is. So at the beginning of your journey, give yourself grace. It's okay to cry and to grieve over it. So please act, right? Whatever you can do to start immediately, to put in your interventions. That's really important. So that period of that denial, that stigma, whatever it is that is weighing against you, try and shrug those off. Those are weights that are holding you back. And start your intervention. For your child, look at the child, and we've said that over and over in this podcast, that your child is an individual that has the right to be here, has the right to exist. So nurture that child, and give the child love. I think one of the things that I know for sure brings out the best in a child is you're not just only thinking about whether or not they're going to talk, or they're going to walk, or they're going to be literate. They're talking about whether or not that child, young person, is well emotionally and mentally. So don't just think about physical health, think about emotional health, and love, honestly, love and acceptance. You'll see that child blossom. So I'll say at the start of your journey, give yourself grace, act immediately, as soon as possible. You don't have to be in any specific location. Just know what your child needs and provide it. And love and accept the child. Now, if you're partway through the journey, like I said, I would run through a brick wall and I'll break through it. Just be persistent. One thing I think I'm always looking at things holistically. So if we think about ourselves and how many years we've been on Earth, remember that your child is also growing and is going to be an adult. And I don't think stop learning. So why should you feel that there's a timeline for learning? You know that there are all these theories about at the age of you stop learning at 5 or 7. I don't know who ever gave up that idea. So those theories, they are just theories. They're general. They're not specific to your child. And if I can learn something new, my age, the child can learn at any age and stage. So give that child grace. So if he or she hasn't learned it at 10, they can learn it at 12. If they haven't learned it at 12, they can learn it at 20. They can learn it at 25. There's no timeline unless you are in the grave. So look at it as continuous learning and there's continuous development. In some cases, you might think, okay, this is not progressing. Then you figure out what it is that child needs. If it's not an educational pathway, is it a functional pathway? If it's not a functional pathway, is it just a social care pathway? Just give that young person what they need to feel, to be comfortable, to be well cared for, and don't beat yourself up because you're not God. But what you need to do is to continue doing what you do. You keep on doing. So it might feel discouraging, but I'll say keep persisting. You never know. I'll give a personal example. My son, when did he really start having a conversation? He was already 12, 13. Start having a conversation. So if we had stopped at 10, we would have missed out the opportunity of having a 13-year-old conversation. And even then, it's still progressing. As long as there's life, there's learning. And I think that's what I'll as the encouragement. As long as there's life, there's learning. Today, I can decide I want to learn a new language. Because I'm at this age I am, that doesn't mean I can't learn. I know I'm going to step into the medical zone, but yeah, you can correct me. There's something called neuroplasticity. There's another part of the brain. The brain, we don't know what happens in that brain. But what I know is that something we couldn't do before, we learned to do it. So eventually it happens. My oldest son, because of the medical needs, he couldn't zip up things. I mean, I'm using zip just because it's the easiest thing to think about. He doesn't even look at his zip line, just does it. If I were to be counting how long it took to get there, then I'll be distracted by the fact that it will suddenly just click, because that's how the brain works. Someday you just realize that what you've been working on has just suddenly clicked. And that's no longer an issue. And even if you talk about toilet training, when it just clicks, you don't know how, and then we have an 18-month-old or 2-year-old, and that's our culture. And they will decide that they want to ridicule the young person, but that person may get to the stage at 12. What the point is that it has happened, so you're no longer thinking about it, and you're moving on to the next milestone. So don't get so hung up, and then sometimes take a step back. And when I say take a step back, as in really go like 2 miles and take a step back and have a bird's eye view and look at that your child holistically and say to yourself, has this child truly not made progress? And then determine what does progress mean? And ask yourself, are those things really the most important things that you need to be focusing on? So for example, something else came to mind. People say, oh, how can you be 8 and you can't tie shoelaces? For goodness sake, why must you have shoes with laces if you have Velcro, if you have slip-on? So we also have to think about those things that are mindset, that are not necessary to make you think that, oh, my child is not making progress because they're not doing something that is popular. But is there an alternative? So that you take that off and say, this is more, how do you build that independence for that young person by adapting it to what is making that young person independent? And independence not being that they must do every single thing, but they must do what it is that can help them function. So that will be a note to those that are, and for some that are, you feel there's nothing that can change, just give love and care. Ultimately give love and care. That's within your control. So give that love and care. Don't give the love. Yeah, it's so important. And give that acceptance and let people know that you are not explaining your child to anybody. Give that love, care, and acceptance. That is within your control.
Thank you so much, Izegbua. That's such a wonderful way to end that. That's, love and care is one of the most important things that you can give to a child. I mean, just knowing that children know when they're loved and they know when they're receiving love from their carers, and they can feel it and they respond to it. So it's so important that we don't get caught up in our own worries and stress and demands, that we forget that there is a wonderful person with us that deserves love and care. Thank you so much for your tips in addressing some of these challenges our parents and families go through. I think it's been a great session, a great show in actually coming down to, very pragmatic experiences. I can tell you there are many people walking this journey that will find this very useful. So thank you so much for coming on this podcast session this evening and sharing, experiences, and also giving our families some great and useful tip. I'm sure we're going to have you back again very soon because there's so much to talk about. We'll have you back very soon. I just want to say to families, if anyone listening out there, and want to have some more understanding on these conditions and how to link in, we've got a platform called School Doctor, www.school-doctor.com, and there's information on the condition and questions that you can ask on that platform, and also for some who are thinking of accessing assessment that can be done through that platform as well. So thank you so much, Izegbua, for your time this evening. It's been really good having your thoughts on this. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, giving me the opportunity to share my story.
Thank you. As we always say, early intervention leads to better outcome, and early intervention can only be achieved by early diagnosis. So thank you for listening into the series today. I know some of the things we've talked about today would probably have generated some questions or need to seek clarification. So I'm happy to take questions, and I'll invite you to send your questions to eim@drtakon.com. Thank you for listening in.